It's great to be here today. We're really excited to talk more about kind of the work we do at Pulse and the impact we can have on bringing drugs to market quicker for repurposed drugs in this case. I was going to share my screen. So you should all now be able to see a few slides, just the intro slide. How we've planned to do it today is to make it quite interactive. So we're going to flow through a few polls to begin with. I'll ask Mary Rose to launch that in a second, just to get a bit of a deeper understanding of who's joining us today. Then Famida and I have put together 4 questions which we're going to talk around, which we hope will give you a bit more knowledge on the topic. And then afterwards, just ask as many questions as you want. Please put anything you want to ask us in the chat. We'll be monitoring that anyway. And if you want to interject, again, put your hand up or just say, ask your question as we're going along. We want to make sure everyone feels that they get some learnings out of what we're going to discuss today. So Mary Rose, is it okay to get the first poll up just so we can understand what where everyone is from today? Okay, cool. I think we can end that one. That's good. So the majority of people are from the patient groups, which is great. Okay, so the next one we want to start ask is anyone has any experience with the registry? So if we can get that one up now, please, Mary Rose, that'd be great. This is going to be interesting for us to know the experience everyone has. There's quite a split here as we keep going. Okay, that's interesting from our side to see there's more no's than yeses. So that's good. Hopefully you will be able to get something from what we're going to discuss today. And then the next one, Mary Rose, if that's possible. This one's going to be whether your actual disease area, if you're part of a register, if your rare disease group has a patient registry. It'd be interesting to know if that's the case for some of you. Okay, more no's than yeses. Again, okay, that's interesting from our side to know that it's a topic that many of you have been through practically, which is good. Cool. All right, we'll close that one off and then I'll move on to the next slide. Thanks, Mary. So today, these are the 4 questions that we're going to discuss and talk about. The first one we want to know is what is the role that registries can play in patient data in drug development. It's a really important thing for us is to cover the basics there. Then we want to talk more about the ownership of data and actually how it can impact the value of research, which is a really important topic. I think for all of us, especially in the rare disease space, how that can impact us as patient groups. Then what's the importance of data and data sharing? Again, another very important topic, which I think a lot of you will find really interesting how that can work. And then that central role that data can play in the development of a repurposed drug. Again, we're going into a bit more detail on that topic. So I'm just going to ask Famida to join me. So Famida, thanks for joining us, obviously. Maybe a quick intro about yourself before we crack into the first question. That'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Dan. I hope everybody can hear me. So I'm Famida Shrida. I'm the founder and CEO, Pulse InfoFrame. And before I started Pulse, I was a professor of medicine and computer science, doing a lot of work in clinical trials. And what I found was that there was so much data, but it was siloed and people weren't really working together. And as scientists, we're actually trained to really be focused on what we're doing. But sometimes we forget to share. And really, Pulse was really founded in 2011 to enable global collaboration. And so I'm really glad that we've evolved to where we are today and I'm able to share some of the information and really interact with the audience today, Dan, around registries and what it means to repurposing also and generating evidence. So thank you.
Thanks, Famida. So the first question we want to touch on is what is the role of registries and patient data in drug development? So we've put together some slides. And Famida, when you want me to move on to the next slide, just say, or I'll do that naturally. It'd be great if you just can kick us off on the twists and turns.
Yeah, so, I think there's a tendency, Dan, that's a great question. So we all want something, right? We know that potentially we need data if we're patient groups, if we're pharmaceutical companies, we know that we're going to need to generate evidence, and that evidence comes from data. And so really, I wanted to illustrate that you don't have to start at the top with the big house. And this is to illustrate that the whole journey is very twisty and turny. And essentially, the way that we thought about generating evidence at Pulse was to build a strong foundation. If the foundation is strong, in other words, if you're thinking about the types of data, And we don't know all of the data up front, because I think in the introduction, what was clear is that you don't know what you don't know. So you start with the corpus of knowledge that you do know, define a data dictionary, really then start to grow that as you learn more about the patient journey. And in rare disease, every single patient journey is different, right? So your experience, my experience as patients in our lives has always been different. So how do we characterize that? And ultimately, as long as you know what the goal is, because collecting data for the purpose of just collecting data has limited value. And I'll use an analogy because I really love food. So I always say, well, what if you went to a grocery store, a Tesco or Sainsbury, I guess where you are, and put every single thing you could find on the shelf in your basket? It doesn't necessarily make anything because you haven't thought about what it is that you want to do with all of these ingredients. And data is really no different. Just collecting information for the sake of it doesn't really bring the value that you think you're going to. So we always like to be very circumspect. And what that means is, let's think about the endpoints. Are we going to be using the data, for example, for a pivotal trial? Are we using the data to support pricing reimbursement? Are we using the data to support natural history? Or do we just not know a lot about the epidemiology of the disease, and we want to start to track patients and understand each of these patient journeys? So, if you're not at the end, don't worry, and there should be no anxiety about it. It's start where you can and evolve to where you want to go.
It's actually an interesting point there for me about the data dictionary, and from my experience in the rare disease world I'm in, is that we had to define that at the very beginning, and we didn't have much guidance actually on what a data dictionary was. We kind of stumbled across that term, and what we had to do was to work out, in Tay-Sachs, for example, what the data dictionary would be. A bit more, if you can just maybe describe what the data dictionary actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. So the data dictionary actually characterizes a number of things. It characterizes some of the demographic and clinical parameters that define a particular patient group or multiple patient groups. So as we think about rare disease, there are many data variables or variables and information that define multiple rare diseases. So they're what we call common. And then you have very disease-specific data elements. So for example, there's specific genotypes in some diseases. There are manifestations of a disease in some diseases and not others. And so, for example, if you have a child with CDKL5, you know that they may have, epileptic seizures, and there may be different types of seizures. You know that they're going to have, myotonic problems, or et cetera. So really defining the data elements, the characteristics of the patient is really what helped define the data dictionary. And I think, again, one of the things that you raised, which is important, is we don't always know what all of those data variables are. So how do we figure that out? So let's think about our stakeholders, right? Patients and advocacy groups, key opinion leaders and researchers, and pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies. What we need to do is actually canvas across those groups. And that's how we figure out, what types of data are going to be required. What's important from a patient's perspective in terms of how the disease affects them or their child. And, what are the types of questions that researchers want to answer but don't have the data to answer? And then what do sponsors need to be able to actually take a drug all the way through the regulatory process? And so that's where we start. We actually interview each of these constituent groups to figure out what's important. But then you can't sort of take all of that knowledge and then try to bundle it into a data dictionary. We then have to review the literature. What do we know? What's been published? And then using both, sometimes we working with artificial intelligence actually, and using machine learning to cull through the literature to even look in diseases that are potentially related but not the same disease, to help to build out what we call the data dictionary. And that's a starting point to define the data elements that are going to be important.
Such an important step in this whole process that you really need to spend that time doing. I think I moved forward from the slide before, but it's the issue we've had with real world data really hasn't lived up to its potential. I mean, we have touched on here, it's like quality too narrow. Maybe a familiar review on this as well would be very interesting for everyone and understanding.
Yeah, and I think, Dan, it would be really important to get your perspective too, given the work that you've done in Tay-Sachs. But So one of the things that we talk about in this journey is that collecting data just for the purpose of collecting it doesn't really make sense. So think about the quality, which means where is the data coming from? Where are the data coming from? What is the source? Is it coming from a source that you can go back and verify and validate? If you can't validate the source and you can't verify the information, it contributes to low quality. Okay, so if I know that I'm getting data from a hospital and I can go back and verify that that's part of the clinical record and it came out of the electronic health record, or if I'm getting data directly from patients and they're putting it right into, a platform, then that helps us understand the quality of the data. Quality is also characterized by how well the data are structured. And what does that mean? So just in simple terms, you call something high blood pressure, I call it hypertension. We really mean the same thing, but being able to actually codify the data helps to improve the quality. So I've seen many times where, and there's no harm in starting out with an Excel spreadsheet, but everybody have to be collecting the data in the same way. So not just defining it the same way, but collecting it the same way. So if I'm trying to characterize a seizure, I need to know what it is I'm characterizing. Am I taking a picture? Am I listening to the voice? All of those things help to contribute to quality. And then, there's a big push right now to say, okay, well, patients, give us permission to go and pull all your data out of the electronic health record. That is a single slice of data. And what do I mean by that? Think about how many notes your doctor writes when you go in to see them. If you're a patient or a patient advocate, you know that most of the data about you is not actually what we call structured. In other words, sometimes there is no disease code, such as an ICD code, to even characterize what you've got. I remember when we first started working in CDKL5 over 4 years ago, that disease had not even been properly characterized. And so it was finally, available to have an ICD code, but in the meantime, you're trying to collect data. So just scraping data from the electronic health record doesn't give you that information. And
that's right.
Yeah. So you've moved me ahead. Am I?
That's right. No. Technical mishap. It's fine.
All right. And then scattered and siloed. I think, sometimes perfection can be the enemy of good. And what that means is we know that there are data in so many different places, but just like that journey and that road, don't be focused on just collecting everything at the same time. Start small and continue to grow out the knowledge that you have, because otherwise it's really hard to ever get to a point where you actually have, high quality data that you can start to use for the purposes that you want, which generally are to generate evidence. And then there's a lot of inefficiency built in. So think about patients who are approached to be in clinical trials. I see that there's a great opportunity here to be able to take data and consent patients who are coming in from what we call screen failures. So not every patient qualifies for a trial. If they don't qualify, we should be starting to collect that information. And that's how it ties into drug repurposing. It may be that the drug that is being tested or the molecule that's being tested doesn't actually potentially apply to a particular patient, but that doesn't mean that there won't be drugs that are coming down the pipeline that won't. And by being able to actually characterize patients and their epidemiology and their characteristics, I think provides a really unique opportunity for us to think about, drug repurposing. Are there commonalities in some of these patients that there are already drugs on the market that we may be able to apply, maybe not to all of the symptomology, but certainly to some of the common ones?
It's very important. I just wanted to touch on this. The road to treatment is never simple. This is quite an interesting bit of information that we've put together, because it kind of shows that we all, and for any of our diseases, we want to have a treatment. That's our end game. But to get there, that process can be very, very long, very, very winding. And the idea is that having some way of collecting data in a uniform way can speed that up. And so what we can advocate for at Pulse is to try and simplify that entire journey, to make sure if you spend the time at the beginning doing the groundwork, getting the right data set, collecting the right data you want to use, and it's disease specific, you can actually move that forward quicker. But remembering, and I think at the bottom here, it's really important, research is not static, and neither can the platform itself. You shouldn't be looking at this as an end game that you launch a registry, that's it. You need to make sure it's continually changing with the times as more drugs come to market, as endpoints move, technology develops, things that people use as an endpoint measure now, they weren't using 10 years ago, and what they're using 10 years ago, they weren't using 10 years before that. And that development is very important. That's why the data being captured is very important as well. So for me, any views on that as well?
Yeah, I think, Dan, that's a really good point, because, I mean, the other thing that I would add to that is you can start in one place and continue to move. So I'm going to use, again, the CDKL5 registry. We interviewed patients, we built out the patient registry, and then subsequently the natural history study followed. And now there's a multi-sponsor endpoint study that's going to be going forward. So in other words, don't be afraid to take baby steps, because if you do that, you learn from each experience. And that there should be, yes, we all want to get to the end. We all want to have drugs and opportunities for treatment. But also remember that there's no harm in going one step at a time, and then really trying to figure out where the best source of data are for us to be able to get there.
Cool. So we're gonna move on to the second question now, and this one is about the ownership of data and how it impacts the value of research. So I think the big question is, I always found from my experience, is who owns what, who has the right to use the data, potentially benefit from that data. And I think this slide we put together kind of shows those stakeholders involved in that whole process, the patients, the patient groups, industry and researchers, but they all interject, all work together. But who owns what is the question that always comes up in my personal experience and the experience we have at Pulse. And for me, your views on this and on how the data is collected and distributed.
Yeah, so, I like to use examples. And I think in the introduction, I said, the reason I really founded Pulse was because people were kind of keeping their own data, not sharing it. And we wanted to evolve where we went with research. And I'll use another example from the Castleman's registry. Some of you may know David Fogenbaum. He's written a book called Chasing the Cure. We've built out David's registry for the Accelerate trial. And one of the reasons that we were really interested, and excited to work with David is that the reason he created his registry is that the physician who actually had data in Castleman's disease hadn't published off it and hadn't really, taken the opportunity to disseminate that knowledge. Now, which is really important to note. And so what we have to do is figure out a way, which we've done through a transparent governance process. And in that process, what that means is that, there's always anxiety about sharing data because nobody wants the data to disappear into a big black hole. But by the same token, in order for us to actually publish, to utilize data for the regulators, to really understand each of the constituents' requirements, we have to figure out how to share. So what we do is we set up a governance structure that has a scientific advisory board, which has patient advocacy representation on it, a steering committee, which has sponsor representation on it, and a whole data access committee. Now, what that means essentially that no one person can say that they want to hold on to the data until they've published or until they've done anything with the data. And this is an important thing because otherwise, we can't advance the needle, we can't move forward. So in terms of patients who actually provide information about their condition into our platform, do have rights to the data that they provide into the platform. So the whole system is predicated on being able to share data, because if a researcher doesn't have access to data, then they can't publish. So by bringing all the data together and creating a transparent process, we're able to actually create a global collaboration. So in our platform, a researcher is able to apply to use other data. Everything is de-identified in GDPR and HIPAA and PHIPAA compliant. And it's really so that there is a review of the data that people are publishing. Patient groups can also request to utilize data for publication and other purposes and to support some of the regulatory requirements. It's the same thing with industry. We don't actually provide raw data to anybody because that protects the integrity and fidelity of the data, but also make sure that there is no risk of any identification of a patient, which is really important in, in rare diseases. So hopefully that made sense, Dan, but that's the way that we look at it.
No, and I think it's so important. One of my biggest gripes actually is when you hear about other patient groups or industry or researchers who've collected data and they do nothing with it. It just sits there in a spreadsheet or in a system that they never get around to writing up. And what they need to realize is someone has taken the time to contribute their information, and they have my belief is they have a responsibility to use it appropriately. And so rather than just sitting there, it should be used to raise awareness of the disease, especially in our rare disease space. We need to get the message out there. And the way we did it with Tay-Sachs was to show industry that we had data. And it's helped us actually get studies started in the disease, because they've seen there is a motivated patient population. They can get natural history data. They can understand the progression of the disease. We can start looking at developing endpoints, which 10 years ago, no one had any interest in. Having a data set, using it, writing it up, has really made a big difference to us. And I really hope that other groups now are starting to see the impact it can have. And I've really seen this shift in the last 10 years that I've been in this area, that actually the value of data is so important as we've all moved forward. And we're really starting to see it being used really well to actually develop things. Now we can touch on things like synthetic control arms as well, and to go into more detail on other topics, which is really, really exciting. So just to move us on to the next slide. This is more about patients and patient advocacy support, and how actually that we can get involved in this entire process, which I think is really important, looking at the different stages, the preclinical, the trial design, which we all should as advocates be involved in. It's not acceptable to be brought in at the end stage. We should be having a real input in that trial design. But how do we do that? It's by understanding the disease. How do we understand the disease? The lived experiences that we have, and from the data collected, it gives us many more tools that help develop things and move them forward, and make sure that, especially in drug repurposing, where the timelines tend to be shorter, they want to launch these things quicker. We can clearly highlight the endpoints they're using just aren't going to work. We need to look at something that's disease specific. And if you're looking at basket trial approaches, having a good data set to understand the disease progression can then really make an impact. You can start looking at commonalities across the different diseases in that kind of basket trial to move it forward. I don't know, for me, do you have any views on this one as well?
Yeah, first of all, I echo what you're saying. And I think one of the things to note is, we can learn from failure too. So when you look at some of the failed trials, when you look at the fact that, often there are problems with feasibility because you don't really understand the disease and the trajectory of the disease. And there's some really good examples of looking at therapies that have failed because they focused on maybe the early stage of a disease. But as a disease progresses, the manifestations are different. So you actually need to understand that entire patient journey. Otherwise, you can't target. We're in a world of precision medicine. Even if you're looking at repurposing, something isn't going to work everywhere. So I would very much agree with you, and particularly in the area of repurposing. So feasibility, power calculations, understanding the evolution of the disease. And this is not sequential. So, patient group is critical for trial design and looking at the practicality of some of the data collection, because some of the data collection isn't even practical. So you need to really make sure that your voice is at the table here. And ultimately for pricing reimbursement, that relies, as you know, even in the UK with NICE and some of the other organizations, on lived experience, as Dan characterized. So how does the disease impact your quality of life? And quality of life can only come from the patient and their caregivers, so that once we characterize that, we can actually build cost effectiveness models that can help support why the drug needs to be on market.
So we're going to move on to question 3. So the importance of data and data sharing. Now, I'll leave this one to you for me to introduce. We'll go into a bit of detail. We'll try not to be too detailed on this. It's more about the use case, the patient engagement and data and standards and things like that.
Yeah, so real world data, and I think, maybe we just take a minute here and talk about real world data. Real world data is any data that you're collecting as part of usual care and as part of the real world, as simple as that sounds. But it's very much about, looking at effectiveness and lived experience. So when we think about a clinical trial, we're looking at efficacy because it's a very, much more homogeneous group with very tight controls. So you have a very high level of what we call internal validity. But internal validity doesn't always translate into what we call external validity, which is what comes from a trial. All right, so the types of questions that we're interested in, are we measuring the right things? And so I have seen, especially in the rare disease community, where people are measuring something, but they're all measuring it in a different way. So across several of the registries that we run, we actually looked at questions that are being asked, and they could be around mobility, about, seizures, a number of things, cognitive effects. And so, there's a really unique opportunity to share how we're measuring things too, and how are we defining that? Ultimately, is this a promising drug to add as a therapeutic alternative is what we want to learn about. And with drug repurposing, this becomes really important. The reality is that in every part of the world, we're all sitting here, most of us, I think, from the Western Hemisphere now, there are many parts of the world that actually will never be able to afford some of the new therapies coming down the pipeline. And what that means is that we need to have an open mind to really understand how other drugs can be used. And if you look at some of the, I think groups like Helix are looking at, obviously agents that can be repurposed and utilized, but for them to have an appropriate target, for any of us to have an appropriate target and to know exactly where to use something, there are all of these phases of studies that need to be considered. Generally, obviously in repurposing, you don't need to worry as much about phase 1 and phase 2 because we know about safety because the drugs are already on the market. But really defining what we call phase 3 is important. And the traditional way of doing a study is really a randomized controlled trial. Well, guess what? That doesn't work so well in rare disease communities because there aren't a huge number of patients. And that's where you heard, Dan talk about basket trials or synthetic controls. And that's really where the excitement is now. We have comparator controls where people who are part of a registry actually become a control group, and we're comparing other patients who are in a study to the control. So essentially, you're leveraging data so that more people can participate in clinical trials. And ultimately, this is where we see the future going. And to do that, there has to be collaboration and there has to be data sharing. And so again, I go back to the CDKL5 example where there is an endpoint study that will be starting where 5 or 6 biotech companies are working together, and the patient registry will serve as part of the control, which I think is really exciting.
So this is more looking at where the sources of data can be brought in and used in a registry, which is really, really important because we've talked before that there's multiple sources of data. It's not just from patient-generated data. You can bring it in from wearables, electronic health records, claims and billing, which is more US focused, but you can bring all of this data that can help you to get your disease knowledge to move things forward. And I think the whole point here is having a system that can speed that entire process up makes such an impact, especially again on drug repurposing, where you tend to jump through a few of the steps much quicker, but then they can hit a road if they start to attract working with a disease or a disease group who has no data actually about what they want to treat. So this is why having a platform in place nice and early in your development as an organization is really important. I don't know, Farida, if any views on this one as well.
Well, I think the key thing is to remember that a platform is important. And so what we've built is a platform which codifies the data, because otherwise imagine that you have all of these little silos of data. How do they come together? So again, you've got to knit all the data together. And thinking about, ingesting it and integrating it from the very beginning is important, because otherwise it's really hard to deal with. So the arrow that's blank there is really to create a large cohort, or a small cohort of patients that ultimately the data can be used for all of the things that you see on the right. So I would say, it's identify the data, but then make sure that you're actually collecting it in a way that's usable, which is really where we started this discussion. The way that we've built the world around data is to be able to share across diseases. And so working with the Office of Rare Disease, we actually, worked on defining common data elements, because there's a lot of commonality. You can look across, some of the conditions on the top there. You could look at, Dravet, Rett's, et cetera, CDKL5, all of these kids have seizures. So really building from the ground up and saying, okay, if we're really smart about this, we can learn disease to disease. And even using diabetes as an example, some of the cardiac conditions, many of the kids who have some of those conditions actually have diabetes as a comorbidity, right? Or they have narcolepsy as another comorbidity. So if we don't actually learn from each disease, it will look like what you see on the left, which is every registry living on its own. Yeah. So I think that's an excellent point. And I think educating people about why that's important and raising awareness is something that we have to do better as a community.
Thank you.
And in fact, there's a talk later, I think Taylor Fields is given from Intrabio about the project they did in GM2 MPC. And what's interesting there is it's a basket trial approach for rare diseases. So we put them together and then we picked out similar endpoints that were applicable to the diseases in general. So it meant we didn't have to go around picking different endpoints for different diseases. We picked common ones that could be applied to both. It just meant that actually taking that drug and starting the trial and getting it going was so much quicker because we could identify through the data we captured in our own GM2 registry, but also in the NIMPIC registry, what could be used. And it's a very, really interesting project to be involved in because actually to see the speed that you can move when you have a good data set, you're no longer just sitting there waiting, you need to collect evidence, you have the evidence. So when the company goes, we have this drug, we think it will work in your disease, you can go, great, our data set can show you this, they have access, they move forward, the trial starts, and there is no delay. There's no 6 months, 12 months, 18 months of going out to collect data, if retrospectively or prospectively. So it makes things a lot quicker. So we're just going to move on to the final question. It's kind of, what is the central role that data can play in the development of repurposed drug? And we did just touch on it there about how it can speed up that process because you already have evidence, information, statistics, and you can start working on developing that clinical trial. I think that's a really important thing here, that you don't want to delay, especially in the case of a rare disease or in my own personal experience with Tay-Sachs neurodegenerative, you don't have time. You can't just wait, we'll wait 12 months, we'll wait 2 years. You need to act now if you can. So being able to be responsive and having that data just speeds up that process. And I'm sure Taylor later will give that talk about how that was able to move so fast. Isn't that usual 10 to 15 years of a drug coming to market? The trial was started within 2 years, which is really exciting. And I think a lot of that's down to the collaborative approach of the company, the patient groups, and all of us having data that could be used in the study itself. And then, so this last one here is kind of like looking at with data where you can go on that kind of process. I've broken this down very, very simply, kind of the researching, the development, the designing of a study, and then it's starting. And actually, you can skip the first two really if you have a good data set. You don't need to do any research. That company who has the drug, you know, they'll look around and they can go into your disease group. They don't need to do any more development because their data's already been collected. It's all about actually the decision making and the design of the clinical study. So you can knock off those two stages very early on and actually get to the nitty gritty, which is, can the drug be used in the disease? Yes, no. If it can be, let's start the design. We don't need to go back and collect data because we would have this great data set that can be used. As we said before, it speeds things up. I think that's a really, really important point here. So for me, unless you've got anything you want to add here, we can stop. We should just have about 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Dan.